that only partially. I developed an interest in Ukraine, both for direct and indirect reasons. And the indirect reason being my interest in Russia, the work that I do through the Russia Foundation, and my knowledge that Ukraine is an enormously important country for relations between Europe generally and Russia in foreign policy terms, but also Ukraine exerts an enormous importance and influence in Russian internal affairs for a mixture of cultural and psychological reasons, and therefore what happens in Ukraine matters a lot to what happens in Russia. And I think people who look at things from the outside and who are perhaps not familiar with the two countries perhaps don't always understand that connection. My direct reason for being interested is that I worked on and off for 4 years as part of a team of consultants that was advising the outgoing president, Viktor Yushchenko, on his international communications, and therefore I got some very interesting insights into the ins and outs of Ukrainian politics in that time. And it's a very fascinating country to be involved with for all sorts of reasons. I think this is certainly a very interesting time to be looking at Ukraine as a country, very important. Obviously because there has been a change of government in Ukraine back in February of this year following the presidential elections there, and a great deal of debate about what that means for Ukraine's direction and what it means for EU-Russia relations and for the wider stability of Europe, and in particular the EU's eastern neighbourhood. I want really to make 4 or 5 points, and I'll try and be brief so that I don't sort of hog the time that's available too much. The first point is that Ukraine is a country of enormous strategic importance to Europe, and perhaps more so than most people realise. It's a large country by European standards, both in population terms and territory. It's a major producer of commodities like metals and food, which is going to be increasingly important when we consider the long-term issue of food security, which is growing in importance. As we've discovered the hard way, Ukraine is a very important transit country for energy supplies to the EU, and not so much to Britain, but of course what affects the rest of the EU inevitably affects the UK, especially in the context of an emerging single European energy market. And Ukraine has the potential, at least in the future, to become a significant producer of energy in its own right. That's something I'll come on to a little later. It's crucial, as I said, to the stability of the eastern neighbourhood of the EU. Influence over countries like Belarus and Moldova is very significant. And the line between the EU and Russia can either be a geopolitical and cultural fault line or a bridge between east and west, depending on how things develop. So it can be either a big positive or a big negative for Europe in that respect. And I'm certainly aware over a number of years in my conversations with Russian liberals how frequently Ukraine comes up as a factor in conversations, and the fact that Russian Democrats and liberals see progress in Ukraine as really being one of the major factors of importance in driving change, potential change within Russia itself. So getting Ukraine right is very important, and perhaps I would say more important, for example, than the Balkans, which is a region that has absorbed huge European diplomatic resources, energies, time, money, etc. And therefore is not, I think, high enough up the list of European foreign policy priorities. The second point is that I think the EU in that context has really failed to live up to its strategic responsibilities over a number of years in its dealings with Ukraine through a combination of poor leadership, short-sightedness, enlargement fatigue. The EU has failed really to develop an effective policy towards Ukraine. Although the Orange Revolution was broadly welcomed in the EU, it was not followed up by a really concerted effort to develop a proper policy towards Ukraine. The country was kept at arm's length because of internal divisions over enlargement, and the EU at times has never really seemed to know what to do with Ukraine, which I think has hampered it. Of course, the failure to make progress on economic reform in particular within Ukraine is primarily a responsibility of the leaders of that country in the last few years. But I think that part of the reason also, and a significant element of the blame, has to be the fact that the EU has not given Ukraine the kind of incentives to make difficult reforms that has been available to other post-communist countries, particularly those who've joined the EU. We underestimate, I think, sometimes the importance of a membership perspective in driving reform in those sorts of countries, because it insulates leaderships within countries from domestic criticism and allows them to drive through reforms in the difficult times and to hold out the end goal of EU membership as the reason why those sacrifices are worthwhile. We at times expected Ukraine to do what no other country has done, which is to make the transition to European standards without that promise of membership being on the table. And unsurprisingly, Ukraine has fallen short of our hopes and their hopes as a result of that. So the EU needs to accept its responsibilities more in its dealings with Ukraine. My third observation really is that in terms of foreign policy, it's far too simplistic to see Ukrainian foreign policy changes over the last few months of marking a reversion by Ukraine to a kind of Russian sphere of influence. Far too much credence, I think, is given to the idea that President Yanukovych and his party of the regions are some kind of Trojan horse for Russian interests. There is in fact a significant degree of wariness between Yanukovych and his supporters on the one hand and the Russian government on the other. And it was widely thought at the time of the elections earlier this year that actually Vladimir Putin, for example, favoured the election of Yulia Tymoshenko rather than Viktor Yanukovych as president. It's certainly true that in the aftermath of the elections, the new government took significant steps to improve relations with Russia, extending the lease on the Black Sea Fleet and withdrawing the application for NATO membership. But the new government has also, I think, set fairly clear limits to how far that repression is going to go. It's acted very much in the Ukrainian interest in maintaining or insisting on a maintenance of independent control over the energy supply infrastructure against Russian attempts to try and force through a merger between Naftogaz and Gazprom. The new government has understood the strategic interest in retaining independent control of its energy supply network. NATO membership, in any case, can be exaggerated as an issue of significance because there has never been any time in which the majority of the Ukrainian public has been in favour of NATO membership. So dropping that as an objective doesn't really signify very much, I think. I think the new policy that the government is pursuing, what it calls a multi-vector foreign policy, is one in which it's seeking to enmesh itself in the broadest network of multilateral and bilateral ties. And its rebalancing towards Russia needs to be seen in that context, not as an attempt to try and choose between blocs. It's a kind of non-bloc policy, and in fact they describe it as being a policy of neutrality, and that's really what it needs to be understood as. But in fact, in terms of economic interests, as opposed to geopolitical or military security alignments, Yanukovych has talked about his policy as being a Europe First policy, and that's very much how he talked about it in his first foreign policy trip as president, which was to Brussels, which I think was a significant thing. And what I think needs to be understood beyond the rather simplistic narrative of Westernizers and Russophiles is that actually a lot of the business interests around Yanukovych, although they stem largely from the Russian-speaking east of the country, see their interests as very much lying in deeper economic integration with Europe, the EU, rather than with Russia. To put it quite crudely and simplistically, I suppose, they see their main competitors as being in Russia and their main markets as being in Europe, and that drives a lot of their assumptions about where they think the future of the country primarily lies. My fourth point really is that it's far too early, I think, to leap to the conclusion that democracy in Ukraine is being systematically dismantled. I see a lot of the commentary on Ukraine focusing very much on developments internally. There are, of course, some causes for concern, and I don't dismiss those lightly, but there are also some positive signs which are not being, I think, adequately reflected in a lot of the comments and coverage. There does appear to be a trend of declining pluralism within the mass media, but this is not, I think, in my reading, being driven by a return of state censorship. It's being driven, I think, primarily by shifting political loyalties among media oligarchs, whereas in the past, different oligarchs supported different political leaders, much as they did in Russia in the Yeltsin period, and there was a kind of oligarchic pluralism within the media. There's been a shift of opinion behind the government, and editorial policy has shifted with it. This is not something that's being driven by executive power, it's being driven by a different process, albeit one that also poses challenging questions for the media environment. But I think it's interesting that in response to this, the government is pushing through plans or pursuing plans for a public television channel to provide a kind of public service element to broadcasting in Ukraine, which I think at least shows a positive desire to do something to increase and improve the media environment, for which they're not, I think, getting sufficient credit. And I think the role of the EU and the UK in particular should be to try and engage with the government in Kiev to ensure that they construct this public TV channel in the light of our experience and history, because I think we've got a lot to offer in terms of demonstrating how public service broadcasting works in a free society. So there's an opportunity there which I don't think is often recognised. There have been opposition claims that this week's local elections and the electoral law, which was passed in the summer, will mark a return to the era of rigged ballots. Again, I think this is premature, to say the least. The new law is certainly not perfect, and it's been criticised by international observers and experts in elections law. But I think that what was interesting about it was that in the face of criticism, the government made significant changes to the election law. The provisions that had previously been in place to prevent candidates from newly registered parties from standing, which was the main objection, was withdrawn, which again shows a government that at least is willing to compromise in the face of criticism and make adjustments, not at all like the kind of very hierarchical managed democracy approach of Russia to the east, to which it is often compared. And I think the government also deserves credit for trying to increase the access of independent election monitors. Unlike in Russia in the last presidential and Duma elections, when election monitors were very effectively marginalized and kept out, the new Ukrainian government has, it seems to be bent over backwards to try and secure the participation of the OSCE and other international bodies to look at this process. So they certainly think that they're going to conduct free and fair elections. They want the world to come and have a look at it. And I think we need to judge the facts on their merits and not be swept along by the rhetoric of the opposition. It seems to me that for all her strengths, Yulia Tymoshenko regards any election she loses as rigged. She even said that about the presidential elections in February, despite the fact that international observers regarded them as being the freest and fairest in Ukraine's history. So we need to approach it with an open mind, I think, at least, and give the government some benefit of the doubt. On the constitutional changes that the ambassador was describing, again, I think it's wrong to see the removal of the 2004 constitutional changes as being necessarily an authoritarian move. The opposition itself called for those changes to be made in 2006, and I know this because I was working in my role as a communications advisor to the presidency at that time. The constitutional reforms of 2004 did produce chaotic government. They didn't produce effective government. The critical question is not whether you have a reversion to a presidential form of government. The question is what other checks and balances are around to try and ensure that presidential government is properly accountable. So clarity in the exercise of executive power is a good thing, but the mechanisms of accountability, or what the wider mechanisms of accountability, is what we should be looking at. My final point is that the EU needs to continue to engage and to develop a more effective policy towards Ukraine. The last thing we should be doing is giving up and deprioritising Ukraine. There is still, as far as I'm concerned, plenty to play for in determining the future of the country. The IMF, I think, has shown what can be done with conditional engagement. There is a very serious economic reform agenda now being pursued in Ukraine, which has been long delayed and which I haven't had time to talk about, but we can maybe come on to discuss a little bit more. And I think Yanukovych's Europe First policy, for the reasons that I described earlier on, is probably sincere. It's probably sincere, even if he doesn't necessarily always understand